Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar for our virtual summit series. Today we welcome Jennifer Peyser, Senior Mediator and Director of the Ethical Resource Programme at Resolve, and Neil Harby, Chief Technical Officer at LBMA, to discuss the LBMA and OECD's call to action, the importance of ASM to LBMA, why we're getting involved and what issues are being faced in the current global environment. Neil and Jennifer will assess the action already being taken across the industry, such as supporting reliant communities and looking forward to the future of ASM. Neil is LBMA's main contact for the good delivery system for good delivery refiners and applicants and LBMA committees. His duties range from managing LBMA's good delivery accreditation system, including applications, proactive monitoring, proficiency testing, and more. Jennifer has over 15 years of experience in designing and leading proactive, global, multi-stakeholder partnerships and strategies related to the use of natural resources. She advises industry, NGOs, and government and supports collaborative problem solving to address high-profile and high-stakes sustainability challenges with an emphasis on responsible supply chains. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please email them through to ask@lbma.org.uk. So with that, I hand over to Neil. So Neil, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks Taylor. Hello Jennifer, good to see you again.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
A lot of you watching this webinar will remember that we used to have conferences around the world, and we had one the last one was in Shenzhen, where we really started to raise the profile of ASM with respect to LBMA and responsible sourcing. And really we started that call for action in Shenzhen. And that was obviously long before the coronavirus happened. And obviously the landscape has changed quite a lot since then. The LBMA published a report, a report by Ruth Crowell, which is on our website at the moment, really to sort of highlight this call for action in the current environment. And just to reiterate, just to extract a couple of key points from that report, is that 83% of the world's mining workforce relies on artisanal and small-scale mines for their livelihood. That comes to roughly 40.5 million people. These people were vulnerable before COVID-19 and even more so now. As gold prices rise, so does exploitation and violence for these miners. We're calling on industry, government and civil society to urgently work together to support and protect these vulnerable communities. Now, the LBMA has been involved in a number of initiatives in the ASM space, everything from the RAGS Forum all the way through to helping to develop the craft code to assist with the responsible production of ASM gold. We've been involved in country initiatives like helping Ghana try and sort out its industry with a company called Ansong Askew. But really, the LBMA is keen to get involved where it can in any initiative which sort of helps the ASM sector. Now, the purpose of this webinar, when we first started talking about it, was really to get some of the key players talking openly to our membership, to keep them informed and to help them understand what we're trying to do. What became very clear very quickly is that there's an awful lot of people doing an awful lot of good work in this space. And it wouldn't have done justice to have a large number of people on this webinar really sort of trying to get their message across in the short time that we have. So that's why we've asked Jennifer Peyser to really sort of share with us her experiences of what she's been up to over the last while, because I think she's been involved in a lot of these initiatives, either personally, her organization, but certainly she knows a lot of people who are doing a lot of good work out there. So what I'd like to do is hand over to Jennifer, and maybe you can share with us what is going out there. But before we do that, this sort of graph puts things in perspective. If you look at the amount of ASM gold that's being produced, which is the big orange thingy, compared to the amount of gold from ASM sources that actually is going through GDL refiners, it is a small percentage. And we see there's a huge opportunity pre-COVID, during COVID and post-COVID. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Neil. So you're right. There have been many discussions, lots of really good work for some time on thinking about responsible sourcing of artisanal gold and supporting responsible production and improving the sector. The COVID pandemic has really heightened some of these conversations and given them even another level of urgency. And so there have been a lot of convenings lately to think through what now. Before I jump into exactly all the different initiatives, or a quick overview of those at least, I do want to say that we do know a lot. We have done a lot of tests, had some good successes as well as having learned for some failures. And so in a couple slides here, want to share sort of what do we learn about the challenges, and therefore what are we trying to solve for in thinking about a way forward. So from an upstream perspective, especially we typically think of the miner, the cooperative at the mine site level, the artisanal producers, but also in thinking about the rest of that upstream chain, whether the traders within the country, sometimes even smelting or refining to a point in the country, and certainly the exporters, things that we know need to be addressed. Really a big piece of that puzzle is that we know that the gold will always have a buyer. So it's not that there isn't a market for their artisanal gold, but we really want to make the preferred market and more pathways to get to the formal and responsible buyers. For example, the good delivery supply chains. And so to do that, we need to create incentives in a business case for a lot of those actors which are now in informal chains, not necessarily illicit and with bad actors, but certainly some of that and a lot of informality. We want to provide pathways and, again, incentives to come into formal markets. And that some of the pieces of that puzzle include pricing, including legal taxes, as informal sellers and buyers don't pay those. Thinking about how to finance or pre-buy or pre-finance the gold. Trying to increase production and do it in an environmentally sensitive and responsible way, but just getting more gold out of the ore that the miners are working with. Establishing longer-term commercial relationships rather than sort of one-offs, and really just thinking with this frame of supporting local benefits to inclusive and resilient development. So what can we do, for example, in this time of crisis that could weather the storm for a next wave of COVID or the next pandemic or crisis that comes along within supply chain relationships. So really we're talking about enabling formalization, capacity building, professionalization of the artisanal sector, and also even thinking about those details of logistics and services at the scale of ASM. On the upstream side, next slide, please, and the midstream, there are a number of different challenges thinking about how do we identify sites that are viable, that again might be informal, but that could come into formality and that don't have the illicit actors, and that the risk can be mitigated. So finding those viable sites, being able to just conduct those initial due diligence and the ongoing site visits that are required for high risk sourcing, know your counterparty, and the ongoing monitoring at the site and at the supply chains. Obviously, refiners, for example, not many have regional offices or people on the ground, and so how can we address that in order to support due diligence? Really a primary need is to be able to maintain program or certification status, again, such as with LBMA, Responsible Jewelry Council, Responsible Minerals Assurance Program, and just the many different other kind of legal requirements and the risk committee requirements internally that companies have, whether anti-money laundering, FCPA, et cetera, all of those things which need in the ASM sense, just like in any other business relationship, to be sorted. And then really there's a whole element around cost and financing. So because of the scale of ASM and typical production, every sort of unit of due diligence, of logistics, and of that work becomes more expensive. and it's a real cost asymmetry compared to the industrial market, let alone the need to interact with finance institutions and explain what it means to source from a higher risk country and to have those business interactions and transactions. And again, thinking about being able to establish these resilient supply chains that aren't cut off in the case of emergency, but have a longer term view. So knowing all those things and looking at, again, just the picture of what we know. One refiner said in our Responsible Artisanal Gold Solutions Forum, in the next slide, I think he summed it up well when he said, our lifeblood is our ability to access capital from major financial institutions and participation in the metal exchanges. And to that end, our team has been very cautious managing risk so as to not affect those foundations. So whatever is done in the ASM and however supportively, it still needs to meet those needs. So, in summary, what does all that mean to me? Next slide, please. What do we need to solve for? We need progressive due diligence and progressive and collaborative due diligence, economies of scale for ASM sourcing, upstream and downstream system work at that frontier where they come together, so due diligence can be done on both sides, and cost and benefit sharing between upstream and downstream, or upstream and midstream.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for sort of highlighting the risks that are involved, certainly with the refineries that obviously with the good delivery list we work quite closely with. And some of them, it is too risky. Some of them are saying, yes, we know it's risky, but we're prepared to take that risk. But we have to understand that the risk-reward ratio is something that determines whether refineries can take ASM material. And there are some people who are prepared to do it and some people that aren't. So there are some challenges from a risk point of view, but also from a practical point of view. You touched upon industrial versus ASM. So there's economies of scale here. There's also the size of the batch. Is it commercially viable to be doing little bits of gold here and there? And we have to look at solutions so that it becomes commercially sustainable source of gold for the refineries. Okay, so that sort of establishes where we are and what the layout of the land. But obviously we have to look to the future. We have to look at what are we going to do now? What does the future look like? And hopefully you can sort of shed some sort of light on what the future for ASM looks like.
Well, I'll try, and but as always, like to consider this the start of the discussion, and invite others to join in as well, and get in touch. But fortunately, we do have things to build on and learn from, and there are things in the works. And there's also, I think we're able to design solutions at this point. So first thinking about what's already going on, existing tools and emerging solutions. There are country-specific projects. There are a number of global or regional programs. There are due diligence-specific programs and tools that have been developed, even particularly developed for that ASM responsible buyer interface. And also there's been a suite of work and discussion around pandemic response and recovery. And again, just as noted in LBMA's, in Ruth's note that was published, and as well as in the OECD call to action, there's been, again, this heightened sense of how can we think about kind of a restart or re-engagement with the artisanal sector as borders and travel restrictions are addressed over time. How can we use this as an opportunity for a responsible restart and even a scaling up of the sector? So with these categories, I put together a list, which I was really hesitant to do, but on the next slide, I just at least want to give a sense of the kinds of some of the initiatives under the way, more to give a sense of of the action and momentum necessarily than meaning to being able to enumerate all of them. So as I said, this is a partial list. So apologies to things that I know that wouldn't fit on a single slide or wouldn't be legible at least. But you know, represented here again, we have work that's led by aggregators and you know, traders and exporters within a higher risk country. We have work led by a Women Miners Association in Zimbabwe, in Africa. We have public-private partnerships that are supporting work. We have actual sort of buying clubs, if you will, with the Better Gold Initiative and the Swiss Better Gold Association. We have certification systems that are set up, you know, particularly for ASM and to assess those risks and to support progress and improve performance of artisanal miners. And we have there are a number of donor funds that are about, you know, you use those words, commercially viable. For that is one project, particularly in the Congo, Neil, the USAID commercially viable conflict-free gold program, as just one example of many donor programs that are underway. So there's a lot there, and that's great. There's a lot to build on. I think at the same time, sometimes because of this busy space, it can be challenging for downstream actors, for buyers to know exactly what are some of those points of entry. I would also want to point out in that vein, though, I think because so much has gone on, we have been able to distill some of the lessons from across these. So on the next slide, we have just, again, a partial list, but a list of some of the tools and templates that folks can go to look at. If you're interested in responsible sourcing of artisanal gold, or if you're actually looking at a particular supply chain, how do you know how do you make that assessment? How do you do the risk assessment and mitigation? What are the best practices? And so just a couple I've listed here are the Artisanal Gold Due Diligence template from the Responsible Artisanal Gold Solutions Forum, which LBMA helped create and also adapted on your own site, which is part of your LBMA Refiners Toolkit, which I'd encourage folks to look at. There's also from OECD. Obviously, the OECD guidance stands above everything, but there are particular there's a gold particular publication, frequently asked questions document, which is quite helpful. And then also we have the craft code, which was designed really as a due diligence code of sorts to interpret OECD for artisanal miners and to give a real framework for the risk assessment as well as for risk mitigation and progressive due diligence, which is so important in really being able to scale up with enhanced engagement with downstream responsible buyers. I think just again, sort of in summary, to say what we need and what we want to achieve on the next slide. We said we need progressive due diligence, upstream, downstream linkages, economies of scale, cost and benefit sharing. And to do that, I would posit we need collective and collaborative supply chain and stakeholder action rather than individual companies or miners working together. We need that broader look. We need an ability to go beyond site-by-site pilot projects to get to scale. We need those concrete linkages between mid and downstream and upstream due diligence systems. So really thinking about how those puzzle pieces can technically fit together with audits, for example. And to that point, engagement of banks and auditors who are also often, they're always in the background, they're always supportive, they are always part of these supply chains, but aren't necessarily engaged. And also thinking about how we integrate the miner incentives. So on the next slide, Neil already reviewed a bit some of the calls to actions. I just want to call out, in particular from OECD as well, those calls to foster sustainable inclusion of responsible ASM projects into global supply chains and ensuring the right balance of maintaining integrity and flexibility in due diligence efforts. So again, I think there we really hear that need for if we're going to think about ASM as a pathway for economic development and resiliency post-COVID, as well as just the interest in de-risking supply chains, not de-risking by keeping ASM out, but de-risking by mitigating the risks in the artisanal sector. I think these are really important themes and principles to bring into play. And I also want to offer just a particular tool to help with that, which is the craft code, which I mentioned briefly earlier. But if we're going to have collective action, if we're going to have work across multiple sites and supply chains, we can't have sort of one-off solutions. So on the next slide, just offering again some of the ways that craft can contribute. It is designed with OECD Annex 2 risks in mind, with a first level of pass-fail for the serious abuses. So no question, certain activities, certain risks cannot be part of any responsible supply chain. So pass-fail on those serious abuses. But there's also a way to get to yes on artisanal sourcing and those commercial relationships, which is really important. And that getting to yes looks like risk mitigation and a real progressive improvement framework, which is determined in concert between the buyer and the miners to meet their mutual interest and need. What are the mining, what does the cooperative want to achieve in terms of their performance? What's worth it for them? And what does the buyer need in order to pass all their internal systems and maintain their program status? So again, so craft, I think, provides a framework for that. It was created as a multi-stakeholder tool through engagement and vetting. Neil, as you mentioned, LBMA was involved as part of the advisory group and the technical committee, along with other due diligence systems, artisanal miners, and other stakeholders and downstream users. So it's also an open source code, which means that it's open and adaptable and applicable for anyone to use. It's applicable to any geography and any mineral, and really it's just, think of it as an upstream due diligence tool that can concretely link downstream systems like the delivery, responsible gold guidance, RJC, RMAP, et cetera, to enable this collaborative and progressive due diligence. I think it provides sort of a language and an architecture to do that that's really important. And really it's that common vetted framework that everyone can call upon to implement not just the practices that we know so well from OECD and the traceability systems and all those things, but what are the principles that we're trying to achieve in responsible sourcing from high risk and conflict affected areas. And I think craft provides a code and a way forward on that. So with all that said, as a bit of a proposal and to put that out there in the spirit of collaboration and having an open door for discussion and collective action, on the next slide, this is a concept Resolve has been considering and would love to engage with supply chain actors and other stakeholders on. So thinking about, again, these key elements of scale and progressive due diligence. So thinking at a global level, how can we have sort of a progressive due diligence lab, if you will, to really test out this frontier of upstream, downstream, and what progressive due diligence can look like. And thinking about what do we need to do to move the needle and really shift the perspective to progressive due diligence rather than what has been in many cases just an inability to say yes to the sourcing or to get over those hurdles of due diligence and risk mitigation. With that, we need more work to develop some concrete tools and link to artisanal gold. So we have a great basis for tools to start with, but we even need more, I think, technical support. How do we get audit-friendly craft reports, for example, that make it much easier for an LBMA member or even an auditor of a GDL refiner to make this happen and really troubleshoot some of those sourcing and due diligence bottlenecks as they come up, while at the same time having a regional and multi-site implementation of due diligence with a business plan, a technical plan with minor and upstream incentives and capacity support built in, and sort of craft underpinning all this as, again, that common language and code and framework for due diligence and the upstream downstream linkages. So that's my proposal to put out there, and something that we are working on and have been talking to a number of partners on, and look forward to moving that forward as one way to pull all these pieces together.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. So I'd just like to reiterate the LBMA's position is that we will always support, where it can, initiatives that ensure that responsibly sourced ASM gold enters the legitimate supply chains. And if there are challenges, if there are bottlenecks, we will investigate solutions. We will look at novel solutions. And Jennifer just mentioned the auditors here. One of the things we're contemplating at the moment, and this is just very high level, is how do you do a virtual audit? And if the auditors can't get to the site, or you can't do site visits in the current climate, how there are people on site who can provide information that we would, in this circumstances, we're prepared to entertain. We're prepared to look for novel solutions in the current climate. And certainly what you're proposing, the sort of the lab, as you like, it's a long time since I've been in a lab, but I'm happy to be there again. If we can support it, we have the capacity, we will support it. So thank you for that. I would just like, just in conclusion, is that a lot has been said now. There's been a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of initiatives, but it's because we really want to come up with solutions. And even allowing for all the risks that there are, the fact that ASM gold output accounts for roughly about a third of global non-captive gold production, we've got to do something. We've got to come up with a solution to enable it to enter the legitimate supply chains. So we're really, the people on the call and people who will listen to this or watch this webinar in the future, it is being recorded. We hope that we can get together and we can come up with those solutions that are sustainable and viable. So with that, I would like to finish now, Taylor.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Jennifer. It's really great to find out everything that's going on with ASM now and into the future. I'm going to finish up the webinar. If anybody has any outstanding questions that they've accrued throughout this webinar, please email them into ask@lbma.org.uk, and we will endeavour to answer you promptly. Once again, we thank you for your time and trust that you have a lovely afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you.